Good evening, everyone, and welcome to those of you who are here in person joining us, those of you online. We're delighted to have you join us this evening for our conversation about some of the challenges that are happening in Israel today. I'm Rabbi Lori Kaufman, Director of Content and Innovation here at Park Avenue Synagogue, and we're delighted to have you here. As many of you know, we've been having programming about Israel all spring to both celebrate Israel in its 75th birthday, but also explore Israel and some of the events that have been happening in the last several months. And tonight's program is part of that, both celebration and exploration. I want to introduce the program by just speaking for a moment about the calendar. So we are in the phase of the calendar called the counting of the Omer, which is the time period between Passover, where we celebrate our redemption from slavery and our freedom as individuals, and we count along the journey until 7 weeks later, the holiday of Shavuot, where God gives us the Torah and we become a community together. So we go from a ragtag group of individuals to a community bound by our covenant in Torah. And each day of those 49 days, we count the Omer as a spiritual preparation for getting the Torah, as a reminder to make our days count, to be reflective, and to count the days. But it's also a time, the Talmud tells us, that during these days of the Omer, there was a plague with one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva's students, and 24,000 of his students died. And that plague stopped today. Today is the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer. It's the very end of the 33rd day, what we call Lag BaOmer, the Lamed and the Gimel counting the number 33. And I think it's an important reflection as I think about how I explore Israel these days. And sometimes it feels frustrating and sometimes it feels challenging. But Lag BaOmer reminds us that even when things are dark and frustrating and challenging, there's hope at the end. Things change. Things are not the same forever. So Lag BaOmer is a day of hopefulness, a day of reprieve from challenges, and for me, I find that helpful as I think about some of the challenges as we look at Israel today. Our discussion this evening is with Rabbi Dr. Daniel Hartman, who is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute and holds the Kaufman Family Chair in Jewish Philosophy. He's the author of the highly regarded 2016 book, Putting God Second, How to Save Religion from Itself, and the host of, for heaven's sake, one of the most popular Jewish podcasts in North America that I personally recommend. I listen to it all the time. Daniel is the founder of some of the most extensive education, training, and enrichment programs for scholars, educators, rabbis, religious lay leaders in Israel and in North America. He's a prominent essayist, blogger, and lecturer on issues of Israeli politics, policy, Judaism, and the Jewish community. He has a new book coming out in November 2023, Who Are the Jews and Who Can We Become? We're delighted to have Daniel Hartman here together with us. We have a wonderful relationship with the Hartman Institute. We have several people studying there this summer, some of whom are here with us. And Rabbi Cosgrove has an article that just came out in the journal Sources, published by Hartman, a wonderful, wonderful article that I encourage you all to read. Rabbi Dr. Daniel Hartman will be in conversation with Rabbi Neil Zuckerman here at Park Avenue Synagogue, my colleague, who really needs no introduction. So I leave it to you, Rabbi Zuckerman.
Thank you, Rabbi Kaufman. I would just add also, thank you. I would add that in addition to the article and Sources, the latest podcast, Yehuda Kurtzer, what's the name of the podcast?
Identity Crisis.
Identity Crisis, thank you. They just relabeled the image. The Identity Crisis, this episode is a dialogue between Yehuda and Rabbi Cosgrove, which is an excellent, excellent podcast, and everyone should listen to that in tandem with reading the article. I need to speak personally for just a second, Danielle, because all of the formal ways in which you were introduced are important, and you need no introduction. But on a personal note, to have you here in dialogue with me. So much of the Torah of my rabbinate was shaped by my 3 years as a senior rabbinic fellow at the Institute. I think that a lot of my kids' identity was shaped by their 3 years of traveling there with me, and it's with a deep debt of gratitude to you and the Machon for the Torah that you've given me and that continues to sustain my rabbinate. So it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
We've got about 15 people coming to study with me this summer at the Machon, and looking forward to a wonderful week there. I want to pick up for a moment as a way to open our dialogue on what Rabbi Kaufman was talking about with Rabbi Akiva, because in addition to this being the end of the plague, it also marks a moment where Rabbi Akiva could have turned inward and said, I'm done, all right? Judaism is done. 24,000 scholars have perished. There's no hope. And that's not what he does, right? What he does is he finds 5 students and he begins to rebuild Judaism, and that gives Judaism the hope. And it's one of those critical moments that isn't always talked about in history. I feel like we're in one of those moments where for many Israelis, they might talk about leaving or giving up. That's not what you're doing at the Institute. And we'll talk more about that. But you mentioned in a recent podcast, and I just want to read a couple of your words to open up this dialogue. And so our country, you're speaking about the moment being painful that you're in. And so our country, and we know that how many people are, oying and veying, but it's a necessary part, this pain, just like the Yom Kippur War was a necessary part. There are moments where you have to come close to an abyss to actually ask yourself these deep, profound questions. And I'd love for you to talk with us a little bit tonight in order to open up the dialogue. What are those deep, profound questions we're asking? Because my sense is, and when you and I were talking, last week about this dialogue, that judicial reform is really a symptom of a larger illness in Israel. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about, be a diagnostician here, right? Tell us what's happening in Israel beyond, the judicial reform, compromise, whatever, because there's something more.
First, hi.
It's good to see you.
Really,
welcome.
It's nice. It's wonderful being with you, and it's it's wonderful to be here. You never know a historical moment when you're in it, but you have a smell, like you sense that something significant is changing. And the last election, which preceded the judicial reform, they talked about it, but it wasn't. There was only one small part of the judicial reform that was put forth in the campaigns, and that was who picks the Supreme Court justices. But the last election was a watershed moment when a majority of Israeli voters, not a huge majority, but it was a fair election, the majority of Israeli voters were willing to consider a vision of Israel that for most of you and myself is a nightmare. It's an apocalypse almost. Because it's not the Israel that I yearn for, it's not the Israel that I'm willing to give my life for. It wasn't just and this, by the way, has nothing to do with Netanyahu or the Likud party. 64 members, a coalition was formed in which ideas about Israel, ideas about Jewish nationalism, ideas about the status and rights of non-Jews in Israel, ideas about the place of religion, religious pluralism, women's rights, LGBTQ rights were never a question. There's a very strong community and public awareness that that's a line you don't cross. women are allowed to be put on the back of the bus. That's kosher. There was a sense that we were going to a place that was going to change the whole nature of Israel. That's, if you want to know what's, and judicial reform we'll talk about, or not, but something much deeper was going on.
So why now? I mean, these aren't issues that are new to Israel.
I know,
right?
but
what's unleashed now?
First, you know what it was? It started already. You could trace it, the beginning of it, to the failure of Oslo and the Second Intifada. When Israeli Jews basically stopped thinking about coexistence with Palestinians in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria as an option. Peace was not possible, and therefore something inside of us died. After the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, which was not a peace plan, it was a move basically because we did not want our children serving in Gaza. It was not a moment of hope. But when it unleashed this perpetual barrage, Israelis basically gave up.
And there were people who felt that was unjustified. You mentioned on the podcast, what was the Mitsubishi? I didn't know this story in Israel.
This is Oslo.
Oslo?
Oslo passes, not with a 61 majority.
Right.
They convinced, I forget the exact numbers, but there was somebody, a deputy minister by the name of Goldfarb, I think it was. I forget, Gold something. Gold something, not you. Gold something, who, in order to become deputy ministers, had Mitsubishis. So they appointed him deputy minister, and at the time he left the opposition, joined Rabin's coalition, and I forget the number, but it was in the 30s. Oslo is passed. But that's way before.
But okay, I was confusing Oslo, but there are these flashpoints, right?
Yes.
That have caused this.
But what happens is that we don't. You have to take these moments very seriously, because when you shut down in one area, it's never exclusively in that area. You shut down some of your hope about the future. You shut down your sense of moral responsibility to Palestinians. You shut down moral critique of yourself because you live under the notion that we did everything. That's one part of that story of why it started. And the line between nationalism and ultranationalism is not huge. And the more you feel attacked, the more your gaze focuses on yourself and your own and the need to protect yourself, and nationalism begins to move. You could trace that. At the same time, the political forces which felt that the primary responsibility right now is to protect Israel. And Netanyahu personified that and had the faith of the majority of Israelis. That group of people joined a coalition with ultra-Orthodoxy and created the most monolithic coalition. And really, it's over a decade, it's 15 years now, where it's a perfect relationship, where one side is willing to compromise on any issue of state and religion for the sake of votes for the security of the country. And it slowly but surely shifted the consciousness of Israelis. It's a process, you could see it happening. And so it didn't start now. It's been slowly progressing, and you could point to Netanyahu declaring they're coming out to vote. What was it, in about a decade? Mm-hmm. Like, there is this whole process. And throughout this time, the only ones who are stopping, the adults in the room, was the Supreme Court. And so you begin a process of conflict. One group is saying, we care about us Jews. Do you remember when Elor Azaria, I don't know if you all remember when Elor Azaria, a sergeant serving in Hebron, I can't remember how many years ago, 6, 8 years ago or so, encountered a terrorist who had tried to kill some Israeli soldiers. They injured him. They thought he was dead. Elor Azaria, 10, 15 minutes after the event, comes on the scene, sees the terrorist moving, shoots him, kills him. In doing so, violates Israel's military code of ethic, which allows the use of force only in proportion to the danger that you face. And this person could have been dealt with without lethal means. All of the army command, from the defense minister, Bugi Ayalon, down to the chief of staff, Eisenkot, each one down the line, advocated putting Elor Azaria on trial. And in fact, he was put on trial. The discussion in the country was, who do you love?
Right.
Do you love the Jews? Do you love the Jews, or who do you love? You love them, or do you love us? Who do you love? And this process of isolationism, looking only, it's a combination of victimization, nationalism, chosenness, all together changes the focus of the country, and it's slowly but surely, it reached a boiling point. And there is no doubt that Bennett's move to abandon the right-wing camp for the sake of what he saw as the well-being of the country, and to create a national coalition, which wasn't really a national coalition. It was so-called a national coalition, but there were no right-wing forces in it.
Right. I mean, I have cousins who live in Israel who voted for Bennett, who felt very betrayed.
They were betrayed by him. And ultimately, he remained prime minister without any members of Knesset. Just about all of them abandoned him. And so then after feeling that the election was stolen from them, all that creates a perfect storm in which right-wing nationalism, ultra-Orthodoxy, they win on what is known in Israel as Yamin al-Maleh. A full right government, like no compromises. We don't have to sit with somebody who's going to stop us. We could do anything we want. And all of this is the background to where we are right now. Like sometimes beware of what you wish for. And now we're going to do everything. And the backdrop to the issues that we face is the coalition agreement. If you go back and read the coalition agreement, and people who were in, I don't know, this is beyond my pay grade, but people who were in the rooms basically said that the coalition partners were given a blank piece of paper and say, write whatever you want. And when these forces say, write whatever you want, they put together a vision of Israel, which is an Israel that none of you, forget your children, not even talking about your grandchildren, none of you would want to have a relationship with, unless there are Iran attacks. It's unfortunate, we all get together at Shiva. Weddings we have problems with. I don't want to sit with them, but it's just why them? I'm fighting with them. But Shiva, those moments we always get together. And it was a vision and a picture of Israeli society that was frightening. And the people who were advocating for it were in many ways, they were excited, ecstatic.
Well, they had the power.
At anything, 64, Yamin al-Maleh, without anybody threatening to leave, we could pass anything we want. And when you could pass anything you want, you sometimes try to pass some things. You might want certain things that you need actually someone to help you. So it starts with the Second Intifada, and we don't talk enough about the moral transformation that takes place in Israel from the Second Intifada and the withdrawal from Gaza, and then the consequence of that of that shift, together with a very particular government. And so that's the story that got us
Let me add one other layer to that, because when Rabbi Cosgrove and I were in Israel in March on a UJA mission, and we had a guide who was sort of laying out some of these pivotal moments, withdrawal from Gaza, Oslo. He actually went all the way back to the Altalena, right? That, that the fault lines started there, right? The disillusionment. I wonder, in addition to everything you just described about the political situation, Hartman's been writing about the tribes of Israel for years. It seems that part of this is some of these tribes they hold such grudges, right? Such long grudges that you hear about the Mizrahi representation, Sephardi versus Ashkenazi, and religious, secular. You sort of we're talking around it, but before we get to sort of what's happening now, what?
See, you're right. Israel is a profoundly tribal society. But at different moments in our history, there were politicians who could transcend it. Begin won because of the tribal divides,
right.
But then he turns around and transcends it. And when Begin said, "I am the prime minister of all of Israel," he meant it. Yitzhak Shamir, the most right-wing politician in the history of Israeli society. When Meir Kahane was in the Knesset and he would get up to speak, Yitzhak Shamir would leave the assembly and lead all of the Likud members of the Knesset out of he refused to sit in the room and listen to Meir Kahane speak. So we had tribes. But the job of a leader, and in many ways the coalition governments, are coalitions of tribes. And we do well when different tribes have access to power. This last government, or even the Bennett government, the right-wing and Haredim had no access. In this government, center-left, now Israeli Arab Palestinians is another group, had no access to power. So it just exacerbates your tribal instincts. They're there. But together with those tribal instincts, there's a very strong familial pull amongst Israeli Jews. Pew, as you all know, reports that intermarriage today in the United States is between conservatives and liberals. You don't marry. You just don't. That's the core tribal divide. But in Israel, so you don't marry, you don't go to work, you'll even now pick which state you're going to live in. In Israel, it's there's a family. The family breaks down Ashkenazim and Sephardim. There's not a single family which is not a blended family. Mm-hmm. The family all includes Jews from the former Soviet Union, people who were born in Israel, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, the whole right-wing and left-wing. And remember, in Israel, we don't get together on Thanksgiving and Pesach.
Makes Shabbos dinner interesting.
We get together every Shabbos. Saul Singer, the author of Startup Nation, who's coming out with a new book, one of his chapters is Thanksgiving every Friday night.
Right.
So now imagine, it's not, when you see someone twice a year, how's the weather, how are the Yankees, Mets, whatever, I want to be politically correct here, whatever it is, you talk. There's plenty of things to talk about, and if you want to fight, there's enough things to fight about, but in any event, it's not. Every Shabbos, I spoke about this on my podcast, but my daughter married a boy from Beit El, settlement 30 minutes outside of Jerusalem. His family live in Beit El and other hilltops, names of villages you've never heard. My latest grandson was born on Shabbat. It was a Shabbat bris. I had 28 Ben Gvir voters for 25 hours in my house. I'm not talking Likud voters, Ben Gvir voters. Like, it's my family. We're sitting past the gefilte. Like, what are you supposed to do? It's like, it's not someone you don't know. It's not some disenfranchised something. It's your mishpacha. It's your family. And so outside of the Haredi community, and even then, it's a little, outside of the Haredi community, everybody is blended. So the tribes exist, but then there's a family unit that pushes towards some form of coalition. But it's not strong enough when public discourse, politicians play on these tribal divides and pull you away.
So talk a little bit about you're a rabbi, you have a spiritual institution, it's got an academic institution, but you're a teacher, you're a rabbi. Talk about spiritually what's going on in Israel, right? I mean, politically we understand there's a political party that a lot of people disagree with, and we see the protests. What's happening before we turn to what the Machon is doing? What's happening in Israel, in your view, sort of from a religious, spiritual perspective about what the country's confronting?
Interesting. Israel used to have a very strong religious-secular divide, where secular Israelis used to say, I'm Israeli and not Jewish. About $1 billion was raised from North American Jews starting in the 90s. About $1 billion. I personally raised over $150 million to combat the alienation of secular Israelis from Judaism. Huge. There was a movement. 300-400 institutions. It wasn't one. Bunch of. It ranged from education to culture to politics to anything you could imagine. There was an onslaught of how do we engage secular Israelis with their Judaism? Because in Israel, Judaism as a religion belongs to Orthodoxy, and if you're not Orthodox, you're outside of the story. One of the greatest educational successes was the success of this, it was called in Israel the renewal movement. Hundreds of synagogues. It didn't, even conservative reform grew, but that wasn't the primary, they weren't the primary players. They're there. The primary players was an engagement of Israelis with their tradition. And Israelis today are very, very Jewish. Even the most secular are very, very Jewish. The only time they embrace their anti-Jewish sentiments is when you come to visit. They love aggravating you. It's like it's an Israeli thing, because there's a whole passive-aggressive thing going on, which is something we could talk about another time. But they love aggravating you, because they know you're Jewish. I'm Israeli, I'm not. Like it's a thing, And they do that, and then they say, shut up unless you make aliyah. It's like a whole thing. They have your number, and they know exactly what to say. And it's a whole, it's a family dynamic thing. But Israelis are unbelievably Jewish. Israelis live a Jewish calendar easily 250 days a year, actively. Purim, it's a month-long holiday. Literally, it is. It's from when you start buying your kids' costumes. Hanukkah is a month long. You go to the supermarkets, what's on the shelves changes. TV shows start speaking about, near Shavuos, about cheese recipes. It's like, no, The whole Shabbos starts on Friday when a whole industry of flowers being sold in streets all over the country. So there's a very strong engagement on a personal level with Judaism in Israel. Israelis live engaged Jewish lives. They don't go to shul. They're like the more observant conservative and Reform Jews. So that's on a spiritual. At the same time that they have done this, but again, let me just open a caveat. This Jewish activism has nothing to do with the public sphere. It's in the private sphere. In the public sphere, they're willing to allocate that to Orthodox parties for the sake of coalition agreements. So on the personal sphere, secular kids in Tel Aviv, if they don't, first of all, everybody goes home for Shabbos. If you don't go home for Shabbos, your secular friends are going to have a Shabbos dinner together. And it'll be called a Shabbos dinner. You'll make hamotzi, you're having a Shabbos dinner. So I'm not even talking about Yom Kippur and Pesach. And it's just the whole atmosphere. At the same time, in the religious Zionist community, there's been a very strong move towards modernity and liberalism. The religious Zionist community, who used to advocate religious coercion and the vast majority of them aren't interested in that anymore. They replaced it with the holiness of the land, and they began to advocate far more liberal policies. And the tests are the litmus tests are the status of women and the rights of. There isn't LGBTQ. It's mostly gay, lesbian in Israel, and your attitude towards secular society. A third of the religious Zionist community, their children are no longer Orthodox, but they come home for Shabbos. A friend of mine describes the very, very conservative settlement of Alon Shvut, with the gates closed. You can't drive in the settlement on Shabbat. And all the non-religious kids parking outside the gates, and they're coming home for Shabbos, and the families walking their children outside to their cars. So there's Israeli society spiritually, religiously, is far more engaged, far more liberal than ever before. The ultra-Orthodox community, nobody knows yet. Everybody is that's a hard. So it's religious, it's engaged, and that also has a lot to where we are right now.
Right, so I want to come back I wanted to set that up because there's a population to attract there, right, in the work that the Machon is doing. So you describe for us sort of politically what's happening, and we all have seen the protests. I actually, and I mentioned this to you before we started talking, I think I can trace where your psyche is by the podcast titles of For Heaven's Sakes, right? So let me share a few with you, Daniel, just to remind you.
I don't even know what they are. So
there's a method to my madness here, so bear with me for a second. Right after the election, it was Israeli election, the aftermath. That was where you and Yossi were giving live updates. What's next for liberalism in Israel? The fight of return, responding to Israel's new reality. The lovers of Israel take a stand between civil disobedience and civil war. Israel's too important to leave to Israelis. On the verge of a constitutional crisis, right? Like you and Yossi were in a
working stuff out.
You were working things out. You were in a particular. I mean, I think, to your credit, I'm not you. You recognized long ago the Institute needed to shift, right, to giving Israelis the language of a values proposition of the state. And I want to talk about that in a few minutes, but recently I've heard a shift in your voice in how you are experiencing the current status quo in Israel, which on the surface to American Jews looks like complete chaos. hundreds of thousands of people protesting, language of civil war, hearing about startup nation not being startup nation anymore, the drivers of industry leaving Israel. And your last podcast, where you were reflecting on Israel at 75, I thought was the most articulate expression of what this moment could be that I've heard since the last election. And I want you, if you would, and I can read your words, I want to know where you are right now, because you delivered on that podcast a far more hopeful message than I've heard. And I'd like you to share that with our community of where this might be going.
I know I'm a strange person. My wife tells me this consistently. I am more excited and hopeful now than I've been since the signing of Oslo. I am more hopeful of Israel's future now. What is it? 30 years, close to 30 years. Doesn't mean there isn't going to be a lot of pain. But Israeli society is shifting. Israeli society, for the first time, is not marshaling its energy and its attention on foreign policy alone and on security alone. Now, in Israel, you can never let that go. You never can. We just discovered that Islamic Jihad was going to be sending missiles from Jenin. There's certain things that you have to multitask if you're an Israeli. There's stuff that's on your mind all the time, never leaves. But since the failure of Oslo, it's almost been exclusively on security, hunkering down, and improving our lives. And it was unbelievably successful. Are you up to date on the happiness index in the world? You're aware of this one? There is an index. I don't know who counts it. Guess where Israel recently showed up? Of all the nations of the world, living in the midst of the Middle East, this is before judicial reform, we came in as the 4th happiest people in the world. For some, that might be a sign of insanity. And that would be a plausible explanation, but this is real. And by the way, a year beforehand, we were 7. Post-Bennett, we got to 4. So what we've been doing is basically not thinking about Palestinian rights, thinking about how do we create the most successful, vibrant, best life that we can for ourselves and our children in an impossible situation. And we blocked it out. That's what we've... And Netanyahu, to both his credit, and people simply trusted him. Like, if we have to pick someone, he's the one we trust. And that's it. Netanyahu himself would speak about, don't worry, people don't have a relationship with us on the basis of our values. They have a relationship with us on the basis of our power. There's only one group that wants to talk about values. Who's that? Do you know who that is? Can any of you guess? Who? Yep. Not even America. America depends on your president, whether they want to expend political capital. Who's consistent? You. That's why Netanyahu said, I had enough with you. I don't want you anymore. You're a pain. You're speaking a language of a relationship that's not what I want to do. I want evangelicals. They will support me without moral aspirations. They're much better partners. This has been where Israel, now, on a personal level, Israelis are thinking about values, engaging in huge projects of tzedakah and concern. As a country, our job was to better our position. It was our time. That was Israel since 2005. And the reason it's not, again, there's many explanations. There was a sense we offered, they said no, so there's no one to talk about. And we build this country in the midst of every 3-4, whenever Hamas wants, they fire it. They have a little problem, boop, fire some missiles. Like this is basically the way. Now, what's changed, and this is what's so remarkable and why I'm so excited, is that Israelis actually are now asking themselves, 1 second, I could be really happy. I could have all the money in the world, and we're a wealthy country. I could have political and military stability in the midst of this chaos. But is that, if we become a fascist, ultra-nationalist, xenophobic country, is that who I want to be? And all of a sudden, in the midst of all of these, what are these demonstrations about? It's not the reform. It's like, I feel like people finally mastered the reform. It's like, what was it, a decade ago, everybody had to know how many centrifuges you needed to get it. Like there were certain things you got to know. So everybody, we sort of mastered all the details of the reform. And you had to know them. But it wasn't that. It's what the reform was going to enable. It was going to transform Israeli society. It was going to transform the identity of our country as a liberal, and the vast majority of Israelis are liberal Jews, as a liberal Jewish state committed to democracy. And as an educator, there is more openness to talk about and to think about questions of Israel's identity since Oslo. Because Oslo also was a moment where Israelis said, so we embraced peace over land because we said, what's our future? Who do we want to be? So this is potentially, we haven't won. Potentially, this is a remarkable moment. Right after the last election, I wrote a piece in the Times of Israel in which I said, okay, Netanyahu won. There's a strong coalition. It's going to be in power for 4 years. What do we need to do to win? And I wrote and said, we have to convert 10% of the right wing who aren't a liberal. They're sitting on the right, but they're not a liberal. And we have to double the size of Israeli Arab Palestinians who could sit with a Jewish coalition. And if we will have a 55, now there's 40% who are strongly in the liberal camp. If we go to 55%, we have 65, 70 seats in the Knesset, and our job is to convert 10% of the Israeli Jewish population who is now voting on the right, who don't belong there. Well, guess what happened? As a result of the reform, which I call, what did I call it?
You called it the gift that will keep on giving.
The gift that will keep on giving. Not 10%, a third of Likud voters now say they will not vote for the Likud. There's been a 20% shift. 25%, depends on the polls. They shifted. Now, I don't know if they're going to stay there, but there is something happening. And again, the issue, you have to realize, liberal, right-wing, center, conservative, those are irrelevant categories in Israel today. They're irrelevant. There is no far left couple. They're barely in the Knesset. Nobody. No, that's just not the issue right now. Maybe it should be, but it's just not. Nor is there there's a very small right wing. What does right wing mean? Right wing about what? Economics? Look at Bezalel Smotrich, who's the Minister of Finance. Look at his budget. It's one of the most socialist budgets. It has the amount of public spending. And like, this is a right-wing, conservative, libertarian budget. Narishkeit. It's just the wrong it's just the wrong categories. And nobody thinks, there's almost nobody in Israel who thinks that if we just left Judea and Samaria, it'll become the West Bank and peace will reign. It's just, those aren't our issues. So right now, there is this new coalition being formed, which Bennett preceded his time, really.
Right.
He was a few years, now there is actually 25% of those people who see themselves as right-wing in Israeli categories who don't want to sit in a Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Shas, Agudat Israel coalition. That's not the Israel they want. So I'm excited because something's changing. And I know I have long answers, I apologize. But so often we're tempted to think that changes happen from the top down. It's so much more convenient because you actually want to change people, like good luck. If you could spend money, put political pressure on politicians, then I'll have the result that I want. But in fact, what you have now is a social transformation where people are beginning to shift their alignments. And for educators, it creates a potential for a true transformation in Israel. We have to make sure that it doesn't slip back. But so right now, you go to the demonstration. Did you go when you were in Israel? Yeah. You go because it's sort of now a tourist thing. Also, but it's very important. You're showing up and saying, this is my Israel, because now you actually have partners in Israel, people who are marching. Every demonstration speaks about Arab rights. Every demonstration speaks about issues of freedom of religion. Every demonstration speaks about issue of women's rights, LGBTQ rights. The issues that are being put forth in the demonstration are the issues of the Israel that I at least care about, and they're being talked about.
And they're waving the flag.
That's what's remarkable.
Right? It's an amazing, it's actually extraordinary what's happening. And you talk about, the 20% that has moved. You then say, so now instead of having to convert people, and here's where the rubber meets the road, Danielle, I now as an educator have to ask, how do I sustain people who've already moved?
Right.
So this, in my opinion, is the crux of this conversation, meaning you've described the political situation, you've described the shift that's happened, the blessing that awaits, right? The gifts that this judicial reform has brought. There's been a political realignment. Now comes the task of how do you educate people to build the shared Jewish democratic state? Now, you happen to lead an important institution in Jerusalem that's been talking about this for years. And I think you said something about, usually you were on the defensive about this, or you were in the minority. I can't remember your exact language, but...
I was working against the political forces.
That's it, right? And now here you are with this opportunity. And I think it's important for our community to know, because we talk about this sometimes as if there's an inevitability to it, right? That this is where Israel's going, there's a demographic crisis, and in 25 years, there'll be 30% Haredi, which is, by the way, a whole other question and conversation about, the role they play in the state and what they actually want out of the state. We're going to table that. But, that there's just an inevitability of Israel's going to be a theocracy in 30, 40 years. I don't believe it, and I don't think you believe it either.
Now we see it's actually...
Correct.
There's a different conversation happening.
So you are an important part of this conversation. What's happening at the Institute to sort of drive this forward?
Right. It's a very very challenging educational issue. See, most educational institutions are marathon runners. When you work in education, you're in the business of planting seeds, developing ideas. And it's actually one of the most pragmatic methodologies, because Jewish history, we didn't survive because we were the most powerful. We didn't survive because we were the wealthiest. Jewish history is the history of a people who were motivated by values and ideas, who educated themselves, and were committed to something. Like, that's our story. Michael Walzer in Spheres of Justice, he contrasts Jewish society and Roman society, where Roman society distributed free medical care and Jewish society distributed free education. Like if you lived in a Jewish community, you had cheder. Like it was just, you have an inalienable right to know your idea, and this was our power.
You don't have the gift of time right now.
So this is what's changed. This is our challenge. So I'm a great marathon runner in education.
Literally, you've run your share of marathons.
I've ran 15 marathons, but not, I always came in first in my category. I did. Orthodox rabbis who made Aliyah in 1971. And if there was one more, I'm a liberal Orthodox rabbi who made Aliyah, and I guarantee you, I always win my category. In New York, I used to run with a T-shirt which said Rabbi D, because then I go Rabbi, like everybody, like it gave them something to go. But in education, that's what it's about. But now we don't have 30 years. We have 3. We have elections in 3 years. And what is guiding, literally, not just keeping me up at night, but all of our energy, is how do we shift an educational institution and a research institution, which is about developing ideas and rabbis and educators and change agents for the Jewish community, into a 5K running institution, where I don't want 3-year plans. I want to see changes that take place in the field in 3 years. This is a brand new conversation. So I'll give you examples. You're asking? I'll give examples. We have a network of 1/3 of Israeli high schools, secular high schools in the country, where we did it quietly, because in Israel, I don't believe you could succeed if you want public, not press, what is it, public something. If you want people to know about it, they'll just create, it's better quiet. We have a network of 120, 130 schools. They look like normal schools. We trained the principals. We trained hundreds of teachers. We wrote curriculum and basically created Jewish studies for secular Israelis across the country. Didn't talk about it. Today, if an Israeli student is studying Judaism, it's always with the curriculum developed by Hartman, and in many, many cases, it's with teachers trained by Hartman and principals trained by Hartman.
So this is shocking, I just want to say, this is shocking for American audiences. I remember when I was in my 3-year stint at the Machon, that's when Be'eri was sort of taking hold, and you would literally buy hours in Israeli public schools.
Literally, I raised millions of dollars.
Because
it was crazy.
The Jewish part of education had been removed from the public schools.
There was you couldn't, Israel was the only country where a Jew could not get a Jewish education.
Correct. So that's
unless you were Orthodox.
Right.
Like, it sounds strange. If you were Orthodox, the country funds 10 to 15 hours.
Right. So that's evolved, Danielle, and now it's
small, but it's there.
Right.
It's something.
And now you've got this network.
We have this
schools.
network.
Right.
So now, my goal in the past was, I would train the principals, train the teachers, and the goal was for them to institute Jewish studies in their schools. That was the end game. Education, train change agents is what the Institute does. To affect one teacher, 1,000 students. Spheres. You increase your sphere. Life was good. We created Jewish studies. The ministry bought into it, created a new subject in Israeli society called Tarbut Yisrael, Jewish culture. It's now mandatory. It's the whole thing. Great story. So what did we do? We would teach religious pluralism, or we would teach equality. All human beings created the image of God. I teach it to the principals. I teach it to the teachers, put it in a curriculum, and it would be taught to the students. Life was good, but it's not good. Because I need to see transformation. Recently, I brought 50 principals together, and I said to them, I need a movement. If you're going to learn religious pluralism at the Hartman Institute, I don't want you just to teach religious pluralism in the classrooms. I want you to change your bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah program in your schools and bring your students to the liberal kotel. I don't just want you to talk. I want to see it change, because Torah is great in our tradition if it leads to action. So I want to see now action. If you now study this new curriculum of Hartman, which speaks about, there's a Tikkun Olam curriculum, and when I looked at it, it was about Tikkun Olam in the world. I said, I want Tikkun Olam in the Mishulash, in the triangle. I have 20% of my society are non-Jews. What about them? I want you to see. I want you to start now and to engage in another Hartman program in which Jewish schools partner with Arab schools, and students meet and teachers meet. I don't want you just to teach Torah. I want to start seeing liberal transformations.
Okay.
So that's just one example.
Okay. So I have another. I know. So that's.
I'm sorry.
That is, earlier you were describing sort of religious life in Israel and even the secular, right. We all know the different. So that's giving language of Jewish tradition to kids in schools who may not necessarily have that language. That's the Jewish part of the democratic state, okay? What about the already Jewish side that sort of wants to emphasize the Jewish part more than the democratic part?
Right. Now,
what's the Machon doing? What's the Institute
So there's
doing?
two. First of all, as on a practical level, I always work with the converted, because we discover that you lose the converted. So right now, the first thing is I have to solidify the liberal. To convert illiberal Jews to become liberal is not a 3-year plan.
No.
It's a long-term agenda, but there is a 60-70% of Israeli Jews have liberal leanings. I don't have to convert them. I have to start activating them. Now, in these schools, this is not left-wing merits. These are schools, right-wing, left-wing, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, periphery center. So one thing to do, and the next one is to start getting parents involved and to transform the volunteering projects. The first, a 5K as distinct from a marathon is not just about transforming ideas, but creating now changes in behavior. 2, we have a rabbinic school at Hartman, which has trained about 100 rabbis and has a network of another 300 rabbis who've joined.
In Israel?
In Israel. Mm-hmm. Not recognized by the rabbinate. We perform thousands of weddings and funerals and bar mitzvahs, conversions, men, women. We have one of the few ordination programs. I ordain secular Israelis to be rabbis. I don't ordain people who agree with me. There's enough of me. I want to have anybody who could inspire Jews to love Judaism. You could be a rabbi. I'm not ordaining somebody to an ideology. I'm ordaining somebody to a mission, to serve the Jewish people and inspire them. These rabbis, too, they're trained to perform weddings and all. Now, I want them to become social activists. We're changing the way people think about the idea of Torah. Torah, I put one way, Torah, the rabbis say, great is Torah because it leads to action. The great is study. But it's easy because Judaism gave you action, mitzvah. But what is the action of democracy? What is the action of human rights? What's the action of egalitarianism? These are principles which Israelis, you know what? Okay, the Haredim, they don't want women to sit next to them on the bus. It's only their bus. It's okay. We could be separate but equal. All of a sudden, what does it mean to marshal a network of thousands of people that you've trained? Thousands of people. Rabbis, lay leaders, principals, educators. And to say to them, I want you now to take all of our Torah and bring it into the street. I want you to speak about it. I want you to bring your congregants to demonstrate. I want you to begin to live the Israel that you studied. Not just study it, create it, live it, act it, and demand it in the public sphere. So this, and there's a whole slew of new programs that I'm about to launch, which are furthering this, starting a huge, huge initiative to engage Israeli Jews and Israeli Arab Palestinians in a brand new way. the future of democracy and of Judaism in Israel. And at the Institute, there is no, in Israel, which is less democratic, is less Jewish. So we don't buy into this dichotomy, and that's part of what we're trying to teach.
And you have the allies, you said, as you were describing the religious community, about a third as you...
Now, in the religious community there too, how do we strengthen? There is a third in the religious Zionist community,
Correct.
at least. There's 4/3. The religious Zionist community is made up of 4/3. There's the first third, that's yeshiva math, by the way. The first third are religious Zionist Ultra-Orthodox. That's one group. Smotrich, they're the right-wing, mostly messianically inclined section of the religious Zionist unity. The second group, which is, Yeshiva University centrist orthodoxy. They too are against religious coercion. They're not interested in the rabbinate. They're reachable. Then there's another third who are clearly liberal orthodox. Clearly liberal orthodox. Liberal orthodoxy, which has a challenge of survival in America, is alive and well in Israel. And the fourth third of the religious Zionist community are the children who don't see themselves as Orthodox anymore, but still live in the families and are part of the community. There is a whole group who always saw themselves as aligned exclusively on issues of right-wing politics, which if we have the right government, and if they feel confident that nobody, at least in the foreseeable future, for the next 5 years, is going to leave Judea and Samaria, they are more comfortable in this coalition than in a Haredi coalition. What do we need to do for them? And here, and again, this has to be done now. There is ways in which we liberal Jews talk, which when certain right-wing Jews hear, they become alienated. There's certain code words. How do we talk about our values? Liberal Judaism, by the way, I started to talk about this a number of years ago, about creating a liberal Zionist, a liberal Jewish and Zionist coalition. And if prophecy was a sign of wisdom in our tradition, it's not. It's a sign of craziness and foolishness. I would speak about what I saw in advance, but I'll leave that aside. But I started to use the word liberal, and we have these two liberal Orthodox schools. And I brought all the students. I said, we're not religious Zionists anymore. We're liberal, modern Orthodox. Liberal was an alien category. Just in the last 4 months, liberal has been, what's it called again? It's been koshered. It's a legitimate category. Now, how do we change the way we talk? How do we integrate? When you talk about democracy in Israel, those Israeli Jews who feel very Jewish feel threatened. If you want to talk democracy, you have to put it in Jewish categories. We have to create language, and we have to bring it into our political life. And here I'll stop. One small little thing. I don't know if you know this. Whatever a government stands for, its core policies are determined in the 3 weeks to 4 weeks of the coalition agreements, the coalition negotiations. The coalition, there's an election, they talk, they fight, and then they get together, and in 3 weeks, they basically put together the book which is going to guide their coalition. You have 3 weeks, 4 weeks. That's it. Whatever isn't put on the table there is not going to be part of the coalition agreement because each side has to agree. The right wing has been planning for years. And when this coalition or the Kohelet came, and they were ready. Right now, we started a Center for Judaism and State, and I said, your job, right now, you have 3 years. I want 20, 30 laws and policy statements ready on all the issues of liberal Judaism and liberal democracy. I want you to start teaching it to key members of Knesset. We're going to have 3 weeks. We have 3 years to prepare for these 3 weeks. Right. And if you wait, gone. So in this, our whole culture of the Institute has shifted from 42.2K to saying now we have 3 years. And how do we see liberal Judaism changing the way people behave? How do we have a new cohort of, how do we have rabbis speaking this way, principals, schools, creating now a brand new cohort of hundreds of young lay leaders who are going to become social and political activists, giving them a language in which they could live with right wing and center and left. So it's an unbelievably exciting time. We just don't have enough time right now, but I'm a crazy person. I've become crazy. I've become intolerable. It really is very, very intense because we have 3 years. Now, no single institution, I love the Hartman Institute, no single institution could do this alone. We need a coalition, and there are, and that coalition is being formed of multiple different institutions. And by the way, we didn't speak about that. Part of that coalition to change Israel is you.
So hold off on that for 1 second, because the Institute's on high alert, right? And you
We're
made
on
that
hyper.
You, by the way, made that clear right after the election, that you were going to stake out a position. This is where the Institute's going. So there's a lot of work to do, right? You've got a finite time to do it. And I want to come back to the role that we can play. Just give me 60 seconds on your book coming out. Is the book dealing with this issue?
Yes, actually also. I actually wrote about another 100 pages to the book and took out other ones because of had to update it because of the election. The book is about what makes us Jewish. What are the core features that define the essence of the way Jews have told their story? And how do these ideas, these core ideas that accompanied us for 3,000 years, the first half of the book is talking about what is this DNA of the Jewish story, and how, if you incorporate this DNA, how do you look at some of the fundamental challenges facing Jewish life in Israel and in North America?
It feels to me you're describing like a new phase of Zionism, right? Which is what sounds exciting, right? The swamps have been drained, and this is a new fight.
And it's so much more exciting. You know, I loved successful Israel. I love being comfortable. I do. I love, it's really nice. Like when I travel to Europe, I think I'm going to a third world country. So like sometimes we're real, it's unbelievable how exciting and vibrant and well. But this, to fight now about what Israel is going to be, not if Israel's going to be, but what it's going to be.
Yeah, that's the change I heard in the podcasts, right? From veering towards Yeush, veering towards despair, and finally saying, we've got to stand up and fight. Last question, then we'll call it a night. What can we do? American Jews are watching this from the sidelines. There has been a time when we've been told to stay quiet, and now is a time when we're hearing, we need to hear your voices. What can we do?
First of all, you have to control that core instinct in you which tells you to be quiet. We've trained you. Israelis have trained you to be silent supporters. Because you're 6,000 to 10,000 miles away and your kids aren't on the line, it is so deep in North American consciousness. The lovers of Israel, you've been trained to be quiet, to feel that I don't really have a place. It's not really my job. My job is to support. My job is to support whoever is the democratically elected representative of Israel. My job, since it's not my kids, is just what do you need? And therefore, I'm going to look at the social welfare issues, immigration, all the other issues I'm going to leave to Israelis. The first thing you have to do is work on yourself and overcome your basic inhibition. Overcome it. And the second thing is, and the most important, is you have to start speaking out in a powerful, consistent, organized manner. Let me be clear. I'm not waiting for you to tell me when my son should go to war. You can have an opinion, like everybody has. Opinions you can have. But be very, very modest. This has nothing to do with war. This has nothing to do with life and death. This has nothing to do with whether you live in Israel or not. This has to do with whether Israel is going to continue to be a part of Jewish life. That's what's on the table. Jewish life in Israel and Jewish life. Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people. It is not the homeland of Israeli Jews. It's not, never saw itself as such. To argue that is to undermine the essence of the legitimacy of the state of Israel. That which called on you to support now calls on you to participate and to have your voice. Talk about it. Talk about it in your synagogues. More than that, your voices need to be heard, and I want to tell you, Israelis up till now never, always ignored you. Unless there was anti-Semitism, Israelis love talking about anti-Semitism in North America and love talking about intermarriage. It's their two favorite topics about you. Other than that, that's all they want to talk, because each one verifies the supremacy of Zionism. Other than that, they don't talk about you. Now, every time you speak about the reform, you speak about the nature of Israeli society, its identity, anytime you speak out in the last 4 or 5 months, front page, or whatever it is on the website, the front thing. Front. 150 Jews demonstrated its front. Now imagine. I know there's demonstrations in different places. But imagine if there was a massive movement right now of hundreds and hundreds of synagogues and federations and Jewish institutions around America who signed up. And every Sunday, not every week, take it once every 4 weeks, you rotate it. Imagine if there were 100, 200,000, just like in Israel. Imagine if there were 250,000 American Jews who signed up, and every week, 50,000 across the country, connected. There's something called Zoom. There's ways to connect and to see. Imagine what I want to tell you. Those who are demonstrating in the streets psychologically need your support, are inspired by it, and it affects political life in Israel. Israelis will vote for who they're going to vote. But if we want to win in 3 years, you have to show up. Now, it's true. The Hartman Institute, a lot of institutions, your ability to financially support us is critical. I'm not belittling that. But that's not your only job right now. You got to show up. Show up. Sign up. An hour every 4 weeks I want from you. At 12 o'clock. An hour every 4 weeks. Give me 250,000 Jews. 50,000 showing up. I know my math is it's close. But 50,000 showing up in 30, 40, 50 different cities across North America. It doesn't have to be doesn't have to be connected to the portion of the week. Getting up, talking about what Israel as a democracy, a Jewish state means. Not demonstrating against the government. That's, as you spoke about our flags. Wear flags. Demonstrate and talk about Israel that you care about. Right now, the Israel that you want, the future of that story is being written now. We don't know if we're going to win. Hartman Institute, Israel Democracy Institute, JPPI, Bina, a whole bunch, Midrashah. There's a whole bunch. There's real partners. In the streets, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Where are you? In 10 years, when we're going to look back, where were you? You have a chance. And I want to tell you, do you know what it's going to do to you? You're going to feel. You don't need permission to have a voice. Take it. Take it. Talk. Talk as lovers of Israel. Not once a year. Just like all our Judaism, beautiful article of Rabbi Khan. Show up. Right now, Jewish history wants to know if you're going to show up. Not just show up with your concern, but actually show up. And if the demonstrations in Israel, and by the way, the biggest challenge we're going to face is soon the reform is going to get worked off. Some form of a compromise or something. Someone's going to back down. It's not going to go through, because that's over. But the real issue was never the judicial reform. The real issue is 150 legislations that with 1,000 little cuts are going to change the nature of Israeli society. Show up not when Israel's in an existential crisis, but when we are fighting for the type of country that your children and your grandchildren would want to have a relationship with. Where's your flag? Like, are your grandchildren going to want to have that flag there, or is it going to be a shame? Is it even going to be meaningful? Like, what do you even have it here for? Like, what's it even doing here? So for you itself, what are your grandchildren? What is it doing here? Right now, over the next number of years, we have a core battle. You could support, but you could also show up. And the Jewish community has remarkable institutions. Personally, I believe the synagogues have to lead this. And this is not a right-wing, left-wing issue. This is not a divisive issue. It's not against the Likud or for, it's none of that. It's not for this or that. It has to, which conservative reform, liberal Orthodox shul in Israel is against religious diversity, is against religious freedom, is against women's rights, is against the rights of conservative reform. Daniel Hartman, liberal, I can't marry. When I marry someone in Israel, I am subject to a prison sentence. I marry. Not because I'm so brave, because they're not instituting that law, like we almost wish, and then it would really, but this, so what do I want from you? I want to tell you, we need you. Because right now, this is not a political battle. This is a battle of spirit. It's a battle of spirit. It's a battle of Jews getting up and saying, my Israel. Stand up.
It comes down to what I've heard you say numerous times, and that is, what is the Israel that you want to create? What is it what's the Israel we aspire to create, in your language, the nation of aspiration? My friend, as you said, it's you don't have enough time. You know, the day is short. There's a lot of work to do, you know?
It's wonderful being with you, and I really appreciate it very, very much.
I think the key is we cannot disengage from this work.
Right.
And I want to thank you for being our guest tonight. It is an absolute pleasure to sit with you. I'll remind you that there are lots of ways to show up, not just showing up at rallies or Israel Day parades. Or there is an opportunity to be in Israel together in June with right now 15 members from Park Avenue Synagogue to study, to be present, to learn from teachers like Rabbi Hartman and others. If you're interested, you can contact me. And there are other ways, of course. But I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation tonight. Daniel, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And look forward to reading your book in the fall, you said?
Fall.
In the fall.
Inshallah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.